of only solving half the problem. In other words, Herzl only cared about physically protecting the Jewish people. And from that point of view, okay, great. You have a state and Jews will now be safe. But Asher Ginsberger, Achad Ha'am, said, wait a minute. There's another problem that Jews are facing in the modern world, namely that because of the powers of assimilation, because of the fact that Jews are spread out throughout the known world, and all of the various pressures that different nation states are exerting internally on Jews to have them conform to whatever nation they're living in. In other words, if you're a Jew living in France, there's a lot of pressure for you to give up all semblances of outward Jewish identity and conform to being a French Jew. Perhaps if you're in America, there's pressure for you to perhaps maybe go to synagogue once a week, or in other cases once a year, but for the most part, there's pressure to conform to American culture. So Achad Ha'am comes and he says that Israel can't just be a state for the Jews, it must also be a Jewish state, right? We have to infuse the state with some sort of Jewish culture. But culture is the key word there, because Achad Ha'am was interpreting Judaism not as a religion. He did not want Israel to be a theocracy. He wanted Israel to be a Jewish state that was culturally Jewish. So that means that, of course, instead of driving around in December and seeing Christmas trees and Christmas lights everywhere, you see menorahs. And instead of the national anthem being some 20th century German song, you go back into our roots, into the Tanakh, to the Hebrew Bible, to our prophetic sources, and try to find age-old pieces of Jewish wisdom. And so that was sort of the initial battle of Zionism. Then in our last class, we talked about revisionist Zionism, which came about one generation after, and they came on with their maximalistic claim of wanting a bigger portion of the land. And we got into a lot of the philosophy and the ethics of the debate between the labor Zionists and revisionist Zionists in terms of the ethics and morality that people thought, right, the sort of age-old Zionistic question of what do you do with the local population of Arabs there? In other words, how do you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And that was a major ideological debate between in the 1920s, 1930s, and really till now. You can map out the left-to-right debate in Israel, where this is going to be a gross oversimplification, so I apologize ahead of time, but the dominant view of the left in Israel has historically been, you make peace through peace, right? It sounds almost tautological, but the left's view, and I'm not going to say what my opinion is or which one I think is right, but the left's view has generally been, how do you make peace? So I go up to you, if I want to make peace with Alex, I say, hey, Alex, I don't want to fight anymore. Here's something that I have that I know you want. Here's something you have that I want. Let's start a peace talks based off of what we're each willing to give. Revisionist Zionist camp and the right in Israel, which now is the dominant political force in the country and has been for about 20, 30 years, is to say, actually, no, the way you make peace is through power and peace through strength. So if I want to make peace with Alex in this analogy, I no longer go to Alex and I say, hey, Alex, I have this really nice watch that I know you want, or I have this really nice piece of land that I know you want. Let's become friends. Let's grab dinner and sit over this. The way that the right has thought you make peace is I show Alex that no matter what Alex does or what the other side does, I'm stronger than them. And that there is no way that they are going to be able to push back or to fight me or anything like that. And eventually, at a certain point, the other side realizes, okay, we have no choice but to accept peace. And not only do we have no choice to accept peace, we have no choice to accept peace, but on the terms that our side wants. And that has mostly been the right-left debate in Israel, right? Do you make peace through peace or peace through strength? So all of these other ideologies, and then I'll get to your question or your point in 1 second. All of these ideologies are operating under one umbrella framework, which I think is actually one of the most interesting questions that we have in the modern Jewish community. And there's a big debate, and just to conceptualize this debate, taking a step back, is Zionism and here I'm using the umbrella term Zionism, right? All of these movements, are these a natural part of Jewish tradition, or is Zionism a break from Jewish tradition? And the other way to say this is the vast majority of Zionist thinkers in the early 20th century, in their mind, what they were doing was explicitly breaking from Jewish tradition. And it didn't make a difference if you were a political Zionist. It didn't make a difference if you were a cultural Zionist or even a revisionist Zionist. The view of all of these Zionists, right? If you would have a Zionist Congress in 1897 or even 1925, and all of the different Zionist factions would get together, they would disagree about everything. They would disagree about the character of the state. They would disagree about the borders. They would disagree about questions of ethics. But what they would all agree on is that the last 2,000 years of Jewish history and exile and sort of the general modality of Jewish tradition that can be summarized as, right, this is a very crude summary of 2,000 years of Jewish theology, but it is straight out of the Siddur, straight out of the prayer book, right? Because of our sins, we have been exiled from the land, right? That was the dominant view, right? If we took a time machine and went to any medieval Jewish village, and it doesn't make a difference if this was in Egypt or Iran or Poland or Hungary, and we popped in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, and you were to ask, why are we not back in Israel? The answer that everybody would give is, of course, we sinned. God destroyed the temple. God destroyed Jerusalem. And one day, if we act a little bit better, God will bring us back. And one of the things that virtually all the Zionists agreed upon was that that was outdated theology. And because that was outdated theology, most Zionist thinkers saw themselves as explicitly breaking from the more traditionalistic Jewish tradition. And in that way, again, there's sort of a paradox, because Zionism is simultaneously a break from Jewish tradition. On the other hand, for people here, and I suspect everybody here is familiar with a lot of Jewish history and Jewish liturgy, everybody here knows that the idea of Israel and returning to Israel is ubiquitous throughout our tradition, right? It seems like we can't get through any day of Jewish prayer or any Jewish holiday or any reading of the weekly Torah portion without reference to Israel. And so this is a paradox that early Zionism was involved in. And I apologize for my voice. I was at a wedding yesterday, so it's a little hoarse here. This was a paradox that early Zionism was involved in. And the thing that's the most surprising to a lot of people, and here we'll introduce today's topic, is that at this point in Zionistic history, if we were to go back to, let's say, the first 10 years of Zionism, right? Let's say 1896 to 1906, right? Let's just pick a random decade. And you were to map out the Jewish world and their views on Zionism, you would have about 100%, right? Maybe 99%, right? I'm sure there was always those eclectic renegade thinkers. But if you were a traditional Orthodox Jew, you were not a Zionist. It was almost definitional, right? If you were a Zionist, it meant that you were not an Orthodox Jew. And by the way, I'll also add, most Reform Jews and conservative Jews also in the early 20th century weren't Zionists, slightly for different reasons, not as theological, but typically in the early 1900s, if you were associated with a religious Jewish denomination, if you, let's say, showed up to shul every Shabbat, it doesn't make a difference if it was Reform, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, you were probably not a Zionist. And again, it was because of a lot of these reasons of all of these Zionist, early trains of Zionist thought being a break from Jewish tradition. So just before we get into religious Zionism, just because I see that there is a lot of comments in the chat here. Rhea asked, is authentic reality? How do we define authentic? Is this a loose conception without definition? Rhea, yes, 100%. Anytime anybody says authentic anything, especially within Judaism, you should immediately be skeptical. So I'm glad that you wrote that. When I'm using the term authentic here, I'm more saying it from the perspective of, let's say, an Orthodox Jewish community or an early Zionist in terms of what they thought, what they were doing. And so if you were an early Zionist, right, let's say Herzl, Herzl had no preconception, and he didn't even try to convince anybody that what he was doing was a part of Jewish tradition, right? There are always two ways to challenge a community, right? Let's just, big overall ideological battles here, right? Let's pick a completely different, interesting Jewish historic debate. So we have two early Jewish thinkers, Enlightenment Jewish thinkers, that did a lot to change modern day Judaism. So let's pick the two most famous ones. We have Spinoza and we have Moses Mendelssohn. Now, in a lot of ways, Spinoza and Moses Mendelssohn were similar. They probably shared a lot of similar philosophy. Yes, they were, about 100 or 150 years apart. But one of the main differences between Spinoza and Moses Mendelssohn is that Spinoza explicitly removed himself from the Jewish community and was operating outside of the framework of the Jewish community, whereas Moses Mendelssohn was operating from within the framework. And there's always this interesting ideological question that if you want to inspire a community or a movement, or you can even think about politics today, is it best to function within that movement, right? Do you try to inspire change from within, or do you remove yourself from the community and then, lob insults or whatever at it, right? Do you try to inspire change from without? Almost all early Zionists attempted to remove themselves from the community and inspire change from without. So the philosophy of all of these streams of early Zionism that we've talked about before was and I'm going to use this word again, Rhea, but here you'll see in the context, the traditional or authentic Jewish tradition or Jewish community has been very stuck in this outdated theology and outdated exilic mode of living. Therefore, if we want to start a movement, we need to stop pretending that we're still within this traditional Jewish community and stop with this traditional garb and using the language of traditional prayer. We need to explicitly put our foot down, say, okay, we're out. We're starting our own thing. And hopefully that will push the rest of the Jewish community. All of a sudden, in the year 1904, a rabbi who really was what we call in Hebrew an Eloi, or a prodigy, at the Volozhin yeshiva. So this is now the greatest yeshiva in Europe. So if we're comparing to modern day schools, right, you can think of whatever the top university is, right, the Harvards and Yales of today, right? So you can imagine the top student at the top college or university, who after graduation, you imagine you are able to get any job you want, right? So if you want to become the head of, the Harvard Law School, right, you have a direct path there, right? That's sort of the way that the yeshiva system works, right? There's different gradients of yeshiva, and obviously there's a spectrum from, yeshivot that are more community yeshivot all the way to internationally renowned yeshivot, right, Jewish seminaries. And the biggest honor that one could get in the Orthodox world is becoming the head of one of these seminaries, a Rosh Yeshiva. And so a man named Rav Kook, or Avraham Isaac Kook, who was one of these child prodigies as a part of the ultra-Orthodox world in the early 1900s, studying at the Volozhin Yeshiva, and he was really destined for greatness. He was really destined to become the next, really the head of the ultra-Orthodox world. And again, this is at a time when there was virtually zero overlap between Orthodox Judaism and Zionism, right? Again, if you were an Orthodox Jew in the year 1901, I'm just making up a year, you were not a Zionist. And if you were a Zionist in the year 1901, you were not an Orthodox Jew. All of a sudden, Avraham Isaac Kook, who's steeped in a number of Kabbalistic and Hasidic thought, and again, we had about 4 hours to develop this class. We can really delve into how I think I actually saw in the comment section that somebody said the Hasidic movement is a very Zionistic movement, and in a lot of ways that's true. And there's a lot of really interesting research. Gershom Scholem, the scholar of Kabbalah, writes a lot about how Kabbalah and Hasidic Judaism really paved the way in a lot of ways for Zionism. But Avraham Isaac Kook decides to leave everything, right? To leave Europe, to leave the great yeshiva, to leave the Harvard of the 18th and 1900s Jewish world, and show up to a small port city in Israel named Jaffa. Sorry, then it was not even British Mandate Palestine yet. It was still the Ottoman Empire. Show up and to set up a small synagogue in Jaffa. Now, this is equivalent to, in some ways, stepping down as the head of Harvard Law School and going and joining a high school that's in their first year, right? That you don't even know if it's going to last for another 3 years, right? This is considered an absolutely crazy move from any point of view of a typical career path. And it was also a strong ideological statement. And I'm seeing here in the comments a lot of praise heaped on Rav Kook. And Rav Kook really, I think, is one of the most interesting characters that we have in the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. And he did and his legacy is extremely mixed. And so I really want to try to tackle all facets of his legacy. But Rav Kook shows up in, I'm just going to use the term Israel, even though we know that it officially wasn't the country until 1948. Rav Kook shows up. He immediately becomes the chief rabbi of the yeshuv, right? So of the pre-state settlements or housing that was happening there. And he starts to develop a brand new philosophy that's going to be called religious Zionism. And so I wanted to share my screen, and we'll just do a couple of quotes, and then we can discuss some of these quotes. And it seems like there will be a lot of appetite for discussion here, because I'm seeing the comment section move faster than I can pay attention to it. But so we have here a nice picture of Abraham Isaac Kook here. He was much sharper of a dresser than I am. And so just a couple of quotes just to start things off, and then we can delve a little bit deeper into his philosophy here. So he writes that secular Zionists may think they do it. And when he says do it, he really means everything. Move to Israel, settle the land, agriculture, all of these things. They may think they do it for political, national, or socialist reasons. But in fact, the actual reason for them coming to resettle on the land is a religious Jewish spark, a nitzotz in their soul planted by God. Without their knowledge, they are contributing to the divine scheme and actually committing a great mitzvah. And so this is the first step of the philosophy of Rav Kook. And he's making a fascinating shift here, because as the Zionist movement developed, there was another problem for the Orthodox community. So it wasn't just that Zionism in a lot of ways was a break from traditional Judaism. It was also the idea that if God kicked us out of Israel, then God could only bring us back to Israel. And all of a sudden, if all of these secular, socialistic, atheistic Jews are leading the charge, and they're actually the biggest problem for the Orthodox community throughout the 20th century, is that not only were they daring, God forbid, right? I'm being a little facetious here. God forbid, not only were they just daring to go back to Israel and resettle the land, they were actually successful, right? How can a group of completely secular atheistic Jews dare to go against God's will and actually win, right? How is it possible that Zionism is working, right? If you read Orthodox accounts from the early 1900s, and even in a lot of ways until the mid 20th century, the perspective of the Orthodox community is this is a movement that is steeped in something that is impure, right? This is a Tameh movement, and it's destined to fail, right? There is no way that Zionism is going to be successful. So now what happens when the movement that you think it's impossible to be successful is successful? Now, as an interesting aside, right, I think we're all familiar with the Leon Festinger, right, famous study of cognitive dissonance here. And he did all these famous, right, he was a famous psychologist in the mid to late 20th century. And he did all these interesting studies of what happens when a ideological community is confronted with evidence that directly contradicts their belief. And a lot of times, actually, that community strengthens the resolve against what they believe. And so actually, paradoxically, and this is some of the studies of cognitive dissonance, a lot of times people's resolve for a certain religious or ideological or political position gets stronger in the face of evidence against their claim, that much of actually the ultra-Orthodox community started to view Zionism as almost a test, right? God is testing us. And the point of this test is for us to reject Zionism. And the more successful that Zionism is being, the more that God is testing us. And the more God wants to see, well, just how religious are you, Henry? Because are you able to reject what is obviously ideologically incorrect, even in the face of all signs and all rationality showing that, no, this is working, right? So that became the de facto Haredi or ultra-Orthodox view of Israel. And in a lot of ways, it actually remains the ultra-Orthodox view of Israel. But Rav Kook showed up, and Rav Kook says, guys, you have it all wrong. You're starting off from the perspective that the socialistic, atheistic, secular Jews that are setting up the state are socialistic, atheistic, and secular. But really, if you look deep into their soul, and there's a big Hasidic notion of the sparks, that all Jews, right, and this is a well-known Hasidic concept, right, that far predates Zionism, that all Jews, no matter how they act externally, they have this deep Jewish spark within them, that no matter what they do, that spark is not going to be extinguished. And that everybody in their life has times when those sparks are more active than others. And all it takes is just a little bit of, right, if we're going to use the metaphor of a fire here, right, all you need is just a little bit of kindle, right, and a spark can set an entire forest, right? California, we sadly know this all too well, but all you need is a little bit of the raw material, and a spark can set an entire forest aflame. And Zionism, Rav Kook taught, is this kindle. And so, whereas the secular Jews, whereas if you were to knock on the door of the labor Zionist camp, or even the revisionist Zionist camp, and you were to say, hello, Mr. Labor Zionist, are you contributing to the great divine act of rebuilding the state? They would say, no, of course not. We left God in Europe, right? The whole point of us coming to Israel is to leave God behind. Rav Kook would say, you don't even realize that what you're doing is a divine act. And so this is step one of Rav Kook's philosophy. Second, he writes, the role of religious Zionists is to help them meaning all the other Zionists, establish a Jewish state and turn the religious spark in them into a great light. They should show them that the real source of Zionism and the long for Zion is Judaism, and teach them with love and kindness. In the end, they will understand that the laws of Torah are the key to true harmony, and a socialist state, not in the Marxist meaning, that will be a light, an or lagoyim, a light for the nations, and bring salvation to the world. So now we get the second principle of Avraham Isaac Kook's philosophy. If step one was that the secular Zionists are really motivated by this deep down, latent religious soul that's just waiting for a project, the second was that this is actually a messianic movement. And what he means by that is this is as has made it into the modern liturgy of the religious Zionist world, Israel is the Reshit Smichat Geulateinu, which means the beginning of the flowering of our redemption, right? In other words, this is it, right? Us Jews, right? This is Rav Kook speaking. Us Jews have been sitting around waiting for thousands of years for the Messiah to come, right? We pray every day, right? In at least the Orthodox community of the late 1800s, early 1900s, you cannot get through a prayer without talking about Mashiach or Messianism, right? We pray for this all the time. All of a sudden, this is it, right? Mashiach is coming. God is sending us signs. And how are you not listening, right? This is the canon. I'll just tell one joke that I'm sure everyone here has heard, and then I'll take some of the questions in the comments. It's akin to the bad rabbi humor joke where the guy is drowning and he's praying to God, and he's on top of his roof and the floodwaters are rising, and he's praying to God, God, please save me. And a boat comes and says, hey, come on, we have one more spot. And he says, no, I'm waiting for God to save me. And all of a sudden, a helicopter comes and says, come quick. No, waiting for God to save me. And, a couple more things come by, and eventually, of course, the guy drowns, and he goes up to heaven, and he's sitting there in the waiting room, and he's talking to God, and God says, hey, what happened down there? And he says, what do you mean? I was waiting for you to save me. And God says, what do you mean? I sent a boat, I sent a helicopter, I sent all of these guys. So in some very real sense, this is the religious Zionist reading of secular Zionism, whereas the rest of ultra-Orthodoxy viewed Zionism as, or the mistake that Rav Kook levied at the rest of Orthodox Judaism was that they were like this guy that was saying no thank you to the boat and no thank you to the plane. And they were waiting for this, top-down miracle of, right, if, the analogy of the guy standing on his roof, maybe he's waiting for, the clouds of glory to come down and for God to lift him up to safety. Rav Kook said, that is not how it works, right? And the most radical thing that Rav Kook taught, which goes hand in hand with his legacy and his background in Hasidic Judaism, is there's two ways to view Messianism. And this gets into a lot of very important debates and a lot of very important contemporary political debates of what's happening in the religious Zionist world. Because for those who are following Israeli politics today, the religious Zionist community is the source of much political, I'll call it strife, right? And there's actually a political party today called Religious Zionism. I'm going to separate that political party from the religious Zionism of Rav Kook, because I think that there's very good reason to believe that if Rav Kook were alive today to see what's been happening in the movement that he started, he would be very ashamed of a lot of what's going on. But one of the chief principles that Rav Kook taught about Messianism is that Messianism is not a binary reaction, right? It's not that you go from 0 to 1, that Messianism is a process. And that it's not that one day, right, almost the comedic view of Messianism of, I'll call it, right, this might be unfair to the shtetl Jews of the 17 and 1800s, but I'll call it the comedic view of the shtetl Jews of the 17 and 1800s, where one day, they're going to be sitting around and all of a sudden they're going to hear the great shofar blasts, and all of a sudden, giant eagles are going to come and lift us into Israel, and a third temple is going to plop from the sky and land right onto Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, right? To some extent, that is the perspective of Messianism that much of the ultra-Orthodox community, both historically and also, I might add, today is dealing with, right? That, well, any second now, right, Mashiach or Messiah might come, and there's actually a long time Orthodox custom to always keep a bag packed somewhere in your room with enough clothing and materials that if right now you have to move to Israel, right, you don't even want to take time to pack, right? If the shofar blasts come and Mashiach has come, right, why would you, Alex, spend 20 minutes packing up your bag, right? Have your bag ready, because the Messianic arrival is imminent. Rav Kook heard this approach, and Rav Kook says it's exactly the opposite, right? The Messianic era is a long process, and as all great Kabbalistic and Hasidic thinkers do, he switches the divine drama. So whereas in traditional Judaism is much more a top-down religious situation. And this is, right, if we had, again, 4 hours for this, we can delve a little bit more into the Kabbalistic thinking behind this. But just a brief 1 or 2 minute overview. In biblical or rabbinic Judaism, the classical theology is you imagine God as this all-powerful sovereign king, and that all-powerful sovereign king wants something out of you, and so you do it. And who are you to question God's ways? And God is perfect. God doesn't need anything from you. But if God asks Sylvia, Sylvia, every morning you show up and you have to offer this lamb, or every morning you show up and say this prayer, or every Nisan you go and eat matzah, right? You do it. And you don't do it because you view you owing God or you're helping God in any way. You do it because if an all-powerful king asks something of you, you would be a fool not to do it, right? That is biblical or rabbinic theology in a very small nutshell. Kabbalah came and Kabbalah flipped this. So the Kabbalistic movement said, we have it all wrong. Actually, it's God who needs us to heal the world. right? That there's a brokenness in the world, that in setting up the world, the only way that the world was able to be created is actually a pulling back of the divine. Here, I'm going to unshare my screen for a second. The only way that God is able to create the world is actually by an act of tzimtzum, right, in Kabbalah, meaning if God is in the world, then there's no room for a world separate from God. So God actually had to pull back from the world. But in doing that, a great brokenness was created. And so Kabbalah is predicated on the fact that the world is broken, that there's a fundamental brokenness in the world, right? It's not dissimilar, by the way, to the Catholic view of original sin, except for the next step is 180 degrees different. Whereas the Catholic notion of original sin is the world is fundamentally broken and tainted. Therefore, we need to put our trust in another entity to save ourselves. Kabbalah went the opposite direction. Kabbalah said the world is fundamentally broken and tainted, and it's our job to fix it. And that the goal of humanity, and really in more particularistic Kabbalistic thinking, the goal of Judaism is to actually put back together the pieces of the world, right? Collecting sparks, right? To use Rav Kook's language. And the way in which you collect sparks is by doing mitzvot. And once that happens, right, you have now brought back Mashiach. Alex said that's what the Tanya says, right? The Tanya is, of course, the book of Chabad, right? It's the earliest book of Chabad philosophy, which fits nicely under this Kabbalistic Hasidic notion. So yes, spot on. And so Rav Kook takes this idea, this Kabbalistic idea, that you just need to keep on doing more mitzvot. You need to keep on bettering the world, and applying it to Zionism. And he says that every act, right? And this is when you get this fascinating mesh. And this is both one of the most powerful teachings in modern Jewish history, and I'll also say one of the most potentially dangerous teaching in modern Jewish history. Because all of a sudden now, the settling of the land of Israel, the building of yet another building, the tilling of just another piece of land, the settling on just another mountaintop out in the distance, is no longer just an act of statecraft. And it's no longer just, why are you tilling the land? Why are you settling on that? Would say, well, because we need food, and because there's a strong work ethic here. And sure, if we don't get all the hilltops, that's not the end of the world. Rav Kook and religious Zionism said the opposite, said, no, every act of working the land, every act of settling the land of Eretz Yisrael, of Israel, is another one of these acts piecing together this wider messianic picture. And so the state really is part of a means to an end, right? It's not about statehood. It's not about nationalism. It's not even about physical safety of the Jew, right? Rav Kook looks to all these other Zionist movements and throws them out in terms of the end of their ideology, right? He likes the beginning of their ideology, but he says all of their goals are too small, right? We have to shoot bigger. All of these things are amazing. Labor Zionism, revisionist Zionism, cultural Zionism. One of the interesting things about, and this will be the last thing I say before taking some questions here. One of the interesting things that Rav Kook taught was that all of these other forms of Zionism are great, right? He didn't weigh into these early debates about culture or religion, or sorry, revisionist or labor, right? They're all doing God's work, right? They're all doing something incredible and amazing there, but their goals are not lofty enough. Marsha, go for it.
I'm on mute. So again, masterfully taught and woven together, just what you shared about this. So just a couple of questions that, as I was doing some research about the initial wave of people moving to Israel, like from Anatevka, right? This is right before Herzl. This is like in the 1880s, right? There were religious people who chose to go there. And that's why when the first egalitarian Aliyah really didn't have allies in the original Aliyah, because they weren't going there looking for women to sort of prove that they were going as religious people to move to Israel to cultivate the land. So he was all, if I'm not mistaken, I guess I'm asking, he already knew that he had an audience there because there must have been a few 100,000 Jews living there for religious reasons already. Maybe not with a Zionistic theology, but just to go be there. But I'm wondering how they work together with Rav Kook. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a really it's a really great question. So there was a movement. I think we actually talked about this a couple weeks ago called Chovevei Zion, or the Lovers of Zion, in the late 1800s. And exactly as you said, right? They're moving from Eastern Europe. They're moving to the Holy Land. But it was purely motivated by religion, right? That's the difference. They had no nationalistic aspirations. And this actually follows. I mean, in the 17 and 1800s, there was sort of coinciding with Hasidic Judaism, there was a increased awareness, I would say, of the Jewish population of the power of the land of Israel. So perhaps one of the most famous examples of this is in the late 1700s, Rabbi Nachman, right? Rav Nachman of Breslov, who was one of the budding Hasidic leaders, made this really crazy adventurous journey to Israel, right? He actually writes about it a lot, right? He was on a ship for months. They got attacked, right? The ship almost tipped over, right? And he speaks about this as sort of a metaphor for really the Jewish people, right? The tumultuous journey to the land of Israel. But for them, it was purely an act of religion. And same with Chovevei Zion, it was a mixture of either being purely motivated by religion or in some sense also motivated by just sheer need for safety. But there was no sense of we want statehood, right? There was no ambition to set up any political anything, right? That was an afterthought, right? And so one of the reasons why Herzl and sort of the early generations of political Zionism was important wasn't that, right? A lot of people, not anybody here, but when I talk to, let's say, a lot of students, a lot of people mistakenly think that Herzl was the first Jew to have this idea of going back to Israel, right? That's obviously incorrect for a lot of reasons. Herzl didn't even really need to go back to Israel, but right, there's this view that Jews were sitting around for 1800 years, right? Kind of forgetting about Israel. And then one day Herzl's like, I have a great idea. What if we, right? One of the geniuses of Herzl, and really, Herzl was actually building upon a budding ideological movement in the late 1800s anyway, with people like Leon Pinsker and other things, of saying Jews need their own political machinery. And so Rav Kook, in some way, he didn't come up with anything new. In another way, everything he did was new, right? And so there's actually an interesting quote, right? So this is a little bit of, right? So the Chatam Sofer, the head of the ultra-Orthodox world, as a reaction to the Enlightenment, he famously or infamously taught that anything new is forbidden by the Torah, right? That was sort of his teaching. Rav Kook, in as sort of a rebuttal to that, said the old, I'm trying to think of the exact quote. It sounds so good in Hebrew, but I'm forgetting the exact words here. But he said, the new will be made old and the old will be renewed, right? As in a way of we are taking these two things, right? One very old, right? Traditional Judaism, one very new, politics, nationalism, Zionism, right? Nationalism, of course, I mean, everyone here is familiar, but nationalism is an 1800s concept of having a people and a land and nation state and all of these things. And Rav Kook said, these two things fit very well together. Whereas virtually all other Jews in the world, if you were a Zionist, you were only focused on the politics and the nationalism of it. If you were a religious Jew, you were only focused on the religion of Judaism, right? You had nothing to do with Zionism. Rav Kook said, no, these two things work very well together. And one of the reasons why I think, again, this is simultaneously a beautiful and dangerous statement is it's beautiful because it continues on the Kabbalistic or Hasidic idea that God and that the world in its brokenness really needs almost all hands on deck, right? That it's no longer, right? It's no longer us doing things for ourselves or because, God is almost a parental figure is saying, thou shalt do X, right? God needs us and the world needs us. And so by showing up and settling the land, you are fixing the world in a metaphysical way. It's also dangerous because if you believe that what you're doing in terms of politics is a part of this divine drama, then it makes it very hard to be willing to compromise on anything, right? Because you cannot compromise on something holy, right? There is a contradiction in terms, right? One of the most famous metaphors that our tradition has for this is the parable of King Solomon, where you have two women running into King Solomon's temple, and one of them is holding a baby, and the other woman says, this woman stole my baby. And King Solomon, of course, has no idea whose baby this is. And so he's thinking, and he comes up with a test. And he says, okay, we have two potential mothers here. Give me the baby. I'll cut the baby in half, and I'll give you each half of the baby, right? What a great solution, right? I'm a genius. And of course, one of the women says, okay, yeah, right, that makes sense. And the other woman is horrified and says, no, I would rather the other woman keep it than you cut the baby in half. And King Solomon, of course, points to the second woman and says, that's clearly the mother. This is what religious Zionism is, right? This is a metaphor that religious Zionists have been using, because now what's been happening, right? And religious Zionism and the religious Zionism of Abraham Isaac Kook started off very idealistic, right? Rav Kook thought that Zionism would be this long but steady march towards messianism and more land, and everything would be great. And it seemed like religious Zionism was spot on. So just to fill this in parallel to the history of Israel, which I'm sure everybody knows, right? In 1967, of course, as Israel is attacked in the 6-Day War, and as a result, Israel reclaims, reconquers, takes over, whatever word you want to use, both the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, which are the biblical cities of Israel, right? If you ever open up the book of Genesis and you look at where the stories are happening, it's places like Beit El and Shechem and Hebron and all of those places, right? Tel Aviv was not exactly mentioned in the Bible. And so all of a sudden, after 1967, we've reconquered Yehuda v'Shomron, right? The modern day West Bank. We've reconquered Jerusalem, right? Har Habayit Biyadenu, right? The famous 1967 radio from Moshe Dayan, right? We've retaken over everything. And so religious Zionists after 1967 thought, this is it, right? This is working all according to plan, right? Abraham Isaac Kook is writing in 1910 about what's going to happen and about the taking over of land and about the messianic redemption. In the year 1967, 1968, in the religious Zionist world, they were on the heels of messianism. You had major, by the way, after 1967, waves of Orthodox American Jews moving to Israel, actually, because again, they wanted to be a part of this. And all of a sudden, what happens? 6 years later, Israel is attacked, right, in the Yom Kippur War. And this war does not go nearly as well as 1967, right? Israel's caught off guard. All of a sudden, this leads to the 1979 peace talks with Egypt. And all of a sudden, what's happening? Israel is now giving away land, right? Menachem Begin is willing to give the Sinai back to Egypt. Not only that, Israel's engaged in peace talks with Jordan in the 70s and 80s for maybe giving away parts of the West Bank. And all of a sudden, it seems like things are going backwards. And this became a problem for religious Zionists because in the messianic drama, things are not supposed to go backwards, right? And this continues to happen, right? More peace talks, right? You have the Yitzhak Rabin and the Oslo Accords, which was, again, a major threat to the religious Zionist community. And it really woke up a radical element of the religious Zionist community. And we all know that, sadly, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by, right, I'm not going to say just any old religious Zionist, clearly one on the fringe extreme of the movement, but of somebody who is coming from the school of thought of Abraham Isaac Kook and of his son, the second Rav Kook. And they said, Yitzhak Rabin, by being willing to give away land, is not just making a bad political decision. He is chopping the baby in half. And if Yitzhak Rabin is chopping the baby in half, not only does the baby not belong to him, but he needs to be he needs to be eradicated. And so this fringe radical element woke up, and religious Zionism really since 67, but even more so in the last 20, 30 years, has been becoming more, if the state is moving backwards, we actually can't trust the state anymore. And so we need more settlements, more, right? I'll call them extra legal settlements, right? Dodging what the Israeli army is going to do. Then just one more, again, event that mixed into the religious Zionist psyche, and then we can have a discussion for a few minutes, is that in 2005, Ariel Sharon pulls out of the Gaza Strip, right? Gush Katif. And this, again, thousands of religious Zionist families in Gaza. And again, for people who are familiar with the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, Gaza features heavily throughout the Tanakh, right? A lot of stories happen in our tradition in Gaza. And so all of a sudden, as opposed to this great triumph of Israel and Messianism, where we're just marching one step at a time for the Mashiach to come, it seems like from the vantage of religious Zionists that for the last 30 and 40 years, Israel's been moving away from that. And there's been almost a great ideological struggle within the religious Zionist camp, because what do you do now when your philosophy is based off of being that the secular Zionists are really doing this for a religious end? What happens when they stop doing that? And that's a lot of the current political struggle that Israel is involved in now. And the answer that, again, a lot, I'm not going to say all, but that much of the religious Zionist world has chosen to go down, at least for the last couple of years, is if the liberal, secular, democratic state is no longer on the same team and page as us, then we need to discard that. And we need to discard the idea of liberalism, of democracy, of secularism. And so in the last couple of years, again, there's been, really a scary increase in this attitude. And you almost have a reshattering, right? If Abraham Isaac Cook's great project was to fuse secularism and Judaism and Zionism and traditionalism, right now you have a reshattering. Or another way to say that is you have a type of politics that's being practiced that's so motivated by religious fervor that it seems like things might get much worse. And I see just a couple of things in the comments. Sophia said the pullouts cause great financial hardship to the settler. Yes, 100%, right? Life again for the thousands of people who left Gaza, right? It was a disaster. I mean, if people have time later today, or they want to sort of learn more about this, you can go on a Google search and on YouTube, and you can just Google Gush Katif or pulling out of Gaza, and you have videos of Israeli soldiers, right? These are supposed to be the heroes of not just Zionism, the heroes of religious Zionism, right? It's the soldiers that are quite literally doing God's work, all of a sudden coming to houses of religious Zionist Jews and forcibly pulling them out and bulldozing the houses of religious Zionists. And so, of course, this motivates a fervent backlash from this community that I think we're seeing a lot now in the politics. And again, Alex is writing, when we don't have our own identity, you have nothing, right? And again, right, there's been a great collapsing of religious Zionist identity, which again creates the scaffolding. I think, right, this is, again, this will be the last thing I say, and then, happy to hang out for some questions, right? One of the great legacies of religious Zionism, and again, I do think, just on a very personal note, I grew up in the religious Zionist community. The camps and the youth groups that I went to my entire life were B'nai Akiva, which is the flagship religious Zionist institution. I spent 12 years, 6 as a camper and 6 as a staff member in a religious Zionist summer camp. I probably spent a total of 2 years of my life in that camp. And so this community and the ideology is simultaneously one of the most beautiful things, I think, to come out of Jewish philosophy in the last 3,000 years, and also one of the most potentially dangerous, which is probably always how these things work, right? The more positive potential something has, also the more negative potential, right? The idea that just a simple act of killing land and of politics, right? The idea that political action can be part of a great cosmic drama, can lead to some great political action or some very, very horrifying political action. So again, happy to take any questions and thoughts. This is also very much just, I mean, just like all of these, Zionist thinkers, this was just very much an introduction, right? Of course, there are, just like any good Jewish ideological debate within the religious Zionist camp, there are, many different opinions, and there's a whole spectrum of opinions, right? So I don't want to paint the picture that there is one view of religious Zionism, but anything about Abraham Isaac Cook, right, is a great place to start.
So I have another question for you. Oh, Ria, I'm sorry. Let me just ask this, and then you'll go next. With there's all within any group, there's groups within groups within groups, right? There are radical Democrats and moderate Democrats and conservative Democrats. You know what I'm saying? There's everything like that. So I guess my question is, within the current religious Zionist communities, and I'd say there's probably many different kinds, even within Israel, that there's been sub-factions that have created. There have to be some where people really understand the practicalities of world politics, that on some level there's religion. I understand that religious transcends everything for a deeply religious person. I get that. And that exists in Christianity and Islam and Judaism, all the same. But are there voices of reason within what probably Rav Kook would say? He'd probably figure out a new way to spin it now, to say, wait a minute, this is not working the way we had hoped, and a lot of people are getting hurt. So I guess I'm just wondering, does that exist within the breakdowns of different factions of religious Zionism today?
Yes, 100%. I would say one of the most important figures, he passed away. Now it might even be 7 or 8 years ago, but someone could fact check me, was Aaron Lichtenstein. Was one of the students of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who was the head of the modern Orthodox movement in the late 20th century. And he wrote a famous essay after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, where again, just to sort of paint the historic picture, one of the things that was starting to happen during Oslo, just for people who aren't familiar, is out of the religious Zionist camp, people started calling Yitzhak Rabin both a Moser and a Rodef, right? A Moser is somebody who hands Jews over to a foreign government, right? So there's a strong Jewish tradition, right? For obvious historic reasons, that let's say we're in an internal community, right? Let's say there are 20 of us here, and let's say we know that Daniel did something wrong, right? You all know that I cheated on my taxes, right? So there was a well-known Jewish medieval law that if anybody here hands me over to, let's say, the Prussian authorities, right, that is the worst thing you can do, right? That is, right, because again, you're dealing with a situation in history where obviously foreign governments have not been kind. And so you never air out your dirty laundry. And that's what being a Moser is. And a Rodef is, if you know that I'm about to go, God forbid, kill somebody, there is a Jewish legal requirement to kill me first. And so they started calling Yitzhak Rabin both a Moser and a Rodef, basically, right? And again, this might just be the fervor of ideological talking, but in some of the more radical schools of religious Zionism, saying that Yitzhak Rabin, there is a Jewish legal requirement to actually kill him. And of course, eventually what happened was Yigal Amir, right, a radicalized religious Zionist, did go and kill him. And the reaction of most of the religious Zionist world was, this is horrifying, and this doesn't represent who we really are, right? Rev Aaron Lichtenstein wrote a famous essay. I'm going to actually try to find it because I want to, here it is, because I want to share it just for anybody who wants to read it further. But his essay was incredible because what he said was, guys, this might actually be a part of who we are, right? In a way of, we have to do some serious introspection of what's happening here in the movement that we would produce somebody like this. And he said, it's not fair for us to say that this doesn't reflect our values at all, because actually this is somebody who was educated in our school system. This is somebody who was a member of our community, right? And so you've always had this debate within religious Zionism, and still today, there are a lot of well-known religious Zionist thinkers sadly, what's happening, and this is, true for a lot of political movements, the more radicalized elements are winning out, right? They're louder, they're able, right? There was actually a great book. I just finished a book this past week about about settlements between 1967 and 1977. It's called The Accidental Empire, for anybody who's curious. And one of the points he makes is a really interesting point that I never really thought about, which is that one of the reasons why, to some extent, the settlement enterprise was so successful was that it is a lot easier to do an action versus to not do an action, right? And so another way to say this is you could have 90% of the population of Israel against settlements. Okay, great. 90% of Israel will not build settlements. All you need is a couple people that want to go to that next hilltop, build some houses. And if those houses aren't taken down, even though that represents a fringe minority, because it's an action, right, there isn't an easy way to counter that, right? And so I think in a lot of ways it's the same in a lot of these communities. Rhea, go for
it. Oh, okay. So the first thing is the book, The Accidental Empire, is fantastic. And I read it years ago, and it explained a lot of stuff for me. But what I wanted to talk about was from a historical point of view, that the existence of the temple was not good. That with the first destruction, when the communities went to Babylon, they started creating a different form, the rabbinic form. And then in 72 CE, with the Roman destruction, there were a lot of different communities looking for something else. The priests had become corrupt. The system was from the top down. We would not want to have something like that now. And so rabbinic Judaism utilized the temple's customs and reformed them into the Talmud and the type of life which did not resemble at all the temple community. And so these are historical forces, and I do not understand why the religious rabbinic Jewish community continues to promote going back to that time, when in fact it was like a revolutionary type of upheaval. And so it seems backwards, it seems counterproductive, and gets us into that the rabbinic Judaism focuses on community, the temple form of worship focused on the priestly class and on sacrifices. Totally different. So it's something that I never could understand, why in Israel itself that this stuff is promoting and causing upheaval and all types of problems. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And from an ideological perspective, I'm in total agreement with you, and also from a historical perspective. I think again, there's a lot in the I'll give like the religious mind in terms of idolizing or idealizing, ancient times, right? And there's a lot written about. I mean, again, you can also compare this to a lot of political movement that imagines this time in the past where everything was great or perfect, right? Almost the original myth of the Garden of Eden, that there was a right, and this is something that again, it's not just religious or political thinkers, right? How many times have we read books talking about how in the hunter-gatherer, environments of 30,000 years ago, everything was perfect and it was fully egalitarian and everyone was happy. And as far as I know, that's completely made up, right? Like who's to say that these little bands of tribes, right? And so there's always this human impulse to, right? And again, I think it's connected to a lot of these Kabbalistic ideas that we look around the world today and there's a lot wrong, there's a lot broken, and we all know, right? And I think the vast majority of humans are are, have this goal of bettering the world, right? We all disagree about what that would look like, but we all want the world to be better. And so we imagine that there was a time when things were great and perfect. Now we're in a downward slope, and we can just get back there, right? We need to renew what happened. And so I think that just to talk about the psyche of the Orthodox community, right? It's of course something I know quite well. It's a valorized past. So honestly, and again, I say this as somebody who's studied in, various Orthodox yeshivot for, several years, and who, for 30 years of my life was praying 3 times a day to say, God, please reinstate the temple and sacrifices. You're not actually, or at least I'll talk personally, you're not actually talking about the specifics. So when I was praying in the Shemona Esrei, God, please reinstate the, this sacrifice, and, even the most explicit example is the Yom Kippur service in Musaf, where you actually in traditional liturgy, you spend about 3 hours talking exactly about how you cut the animal and how you burn the different parts. Nobody there, I can promise you, is thinking literally that they would want to be in a situation where they were, hacking a cow on Yom Kippur afternoon, right? It's representative of this time when everything was seemingly perfect. Now, of course, from a historical perspective, I can tell you there was no time where we had a Beit HaMikdash or a temple when everything was perfect. I mean, let alone even good. And you don't even need to take the historian's evidence. Just read the prophetic tradition. I mean, if one opens up the book of Isaiah, you immediately know that he's attacking the temple, saying they're so concerned with their sacrifices, and meanwhile there are, homeless people on the streets, and, people that need genuine help. So this is an age-old Jewish battle, but I really think it's sort of the religious psyche of a mythical past. So yeah, that's sort of the best way that I can psychologize this. Alex, were you going to say something?
I mean, it's so what you're talking about is another debate, which for hours and hours and hours, which we can talk about during the temple service of the Avodah service. Yes, there was corruption, but there was